Okay, equanimity in the context of mindfulness. Equanimity means balance. The Pali word, Pali is the language of the original Buddhist text, is Upekkha, Upekkha. And as a word, it's hard to understand. It so often implies indifference, withdrawal, being a little bit sullen. Like an image these days would be like a teenager saying, whatever, I don't really care, but I really do, so it's masking a kind of disgruntlement or separation from what's going on. My first meditation teacher, way back in January of 1971, was S.N. Goenka. I'd gone to India to learn meditation as part of a university program. And Goenka had just pretty recently come from Burma and was teaching in India. So he was my first teacher. And he used to say very often in that retreat, be equanimous, be equanimous, be equanimous. And we used to whisper to one another, what does that mean? I never heard that word before. Have you heard that word? And it is a particularly odd form of the word, but whether it's equanimous or equanimity, it can sound so cold. Like, I don't care. But it really does mean balance. Now, I have to confess, I've often in the past had trouble with the word balance. I would hear balance and I would think mediocrity, boring, no special feature, And it was only later I came to understand within that context of sort of the meditative world, the idea is really that if we can bring our system into balance, what we longed for, insight, love, connection, wisdom, will happen all by itself. We don't have to grab after those experiences or long for them or, try to think like, if I get a big insight before the break, I don't have to come back afterwards. We have a very kind of grabby, acquisitive model just from culture, in general. And so it's different than that. Our work is to bring our system into balance. And out of that, automatically, without deliberation, without lecturing ourselves, the qualities we want will happen. In the context of mindfulness, equanimity, the balance is the balance that brings us to wisdom. So I want to say a little bit about mindfulness, which of course is the word of the hour. And it means many different things. Classically, it means many different things in different schools. And it's also gotten a kind of popularized meaning more these days, which is very valid, but it's also a little different. The popularized sense I get of mindfulness often is an ability to truly inhabit our lives more fully, which is wonderful. If you're drinking a cup of, in this case, coffee, and you're not really tasting it, you're not really feeling the warmth of the cup, you're not really smelling it because you're drinking it while you're absorbed in your email, plus you're on a conference call, plus you have the TV on mute and you're reading the crawl, the bottom line, it's not going to be a very fulfilling cup of coffee. And we tend not to look at the quality of our awareness as having played any role in our dissatisfaction. We think, why do I use instant coffee? I'm such a lazy person, like I've got to get beans. And I think it's not just beans, you got to get a grinder. And then I need something. But if we drink that next cup of coffee so laboriously made in the same way, it's not very fulfilling. So there's a whole scope of mindfulness teaching which returns our life to us. And it's wonderful, to be in touch, to be sensitive, to be aware, to have a sense of much more fully living, is really, I think, what mindfulness is largely known for. And it is great. Classically, mindfulness, most importantly, is the basis for wisdom or insight. Like, it's great to really enjoy your cup of coffee. And I don't think anyone, ancient or modern, would begrudge you that. And they'd urge you to actually enjoy that. But the essential point from the classical point of view is not just inhabiting your life, it's understanding your life. It's understanding, there are all these attitudes and all these reactions that I've been taught all my life were great. We're strong. We're the sign of dignity. They were independent. But what happens when I actually look at them mindfully? What happens when I look at revenge, for example? That obsession with someone else's actions, time after time after time, hour after hour. What about when I look at guilt is another example. It's one thing to feel remorse and to feel, I've got to make amends, or this is lessons learned. I've really got to try to do better. And it's another thing just to be stuck. I'm a terrible person. I'm an awful person. I did this. I said this. I'm terrible. I'm awful. Because there's no energy to move on. So is that actually that useful? The state? Let's take a look. Maybe my whole life I've been taught that was useful, that was good. That this is where happiness lies. This is where strength lies. But really, is it? Let's take a look. And it's kind of breathtaking, actually. We have that capacity. Wow, look at that. Vengefulness is kind of obsessed. I feel like I've lost a lot of time, just going over someone else's actions, which I can't do anything about, or my own actions, which are in the past, not in a useful way. Many of us were raised in a way or have a kind of cultural influence so that we feel compassion is kind of stupid. It leaves you too vulnerable. You care too much. You're going to be taken advantage of. But what happens when we actually look at compassion and caring and so on? I mean, why do you think there is such an epidemic of loneliness, for example? If it were not for the avoidance of connection and the sense of that's the wrong way to go. My favorite saying to sort of take apart is it's a dog eat dog world. And what a ridiculous saying, first of all, but it's a dog eat dog world. And yet it's a frame of reference that many of us are taught. Don't help anybody else because they're not going to help you. And do whatever you need to do to get ahead and be number one, because that's all that counts. It doesn't matter what you do on the way up. And it's a dog eat dog world. So I was teaching somewhere. It was a 6-day seminar. I was co-teaching, and I opened my part by talking about that saying. And this young woman came up to the microphone and she said, I never realized that was the saying. I always thought it's a doggy dog world, like DOGGY, like puppies jumping up and down in meadows and things like that. I never realized it was a dog eat dog world. So 6 days went by and we were having like a closing circle. And she came up again to the microphone, and she said, I've decided I'm not going to live in a dog eat dog world. I'm going to live in a dog eat dog world, which I thought was fabulous. So when we describe mindfulness, ultimately, we can bear in mind that the goal is wisdom. We want to inhabit our lives. We want to live fully. We want to enjoy that cup of coffee and every delight that can come our way, and the sense of being present in a different way with painful things as well. But the point of that ultimately is wisdom. It's understanding, because then we can really reconfigure our lives based on what we know, not what someone else tells us to believe or to follow. The way we get from mindfulness to wisdom is through equanimity, and that is being able to pay attention to our experience without like an immediate reaction of holding on, pushing away, or spacing out, without kind of jumping on the experience with clinging. I've got to keep this, or fear. I've got to avoid this, whatever, or anger. I shouldn't have let this happen. This is all my fault. Or spaced out, which is my favorite. You just kind of go somewhere else. It's like you take a little nap right in the middle of the day, even with your eyes open. We disconnect, we space out, we get numb. Mindfulness, by definition, is a quality of awareness where our perception of what's happening in the present moment is not distorted by bias. So many times something unpleasant will come up. We feel pain in our body, or we feel heartache, we feel disappointment, and right away we pile on what's going to feel like tonight, what's going to feel like tomorrow, what's it going to feel like next week. And so not only do we have the actual difficulty, we have all that anticipation on top of it, and it's nearly unbearable. We're not saying we're going to wipe out the feeling tone, but we're going to take a strong look at those add-ons. Maybe something uncomfortable is happening, and right away you add, again, just through force of habit, you add a sense of isolation. It's only me. I'm the only one. No one could ever understand. So then we are facing whatever it is, feeling all alone on top of it, rather than feeling like we are part of the human community or family or any community of a particular kind of incident. Maybe we add that sense of failed control and bitterness, like, should have been able to stop it. I've been meditating for 50 years, for God's sake. Why is that still happening? Or I spent all that money in psychotherapy. Why is that still happening? Or there's so many things we might add on. And equanimity, balance, invites us to not add them on. We may see them, they may arise, those reactions, but we see if we can relinquish them. That's what we're talking about. That returns us to the original experience, whatever it is, pleasant, painful, or neutral. And we have the chance then to really look deeply into it, because we're not afraid, we're not pulling back, we're not adding an infinite period of time to it and kind of trying to hold the burden of all that. I'm going to be angry for the rest of my life, something like that. Probably my favorite example in Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text, it's called papancha, P-A-P-A-N-C-A, and it means proliferation. I heard one translator once describe it as the imperialistic tendency of mind, where something happens and the whole world is taken over. So probably my favorite story about that is I was teaching with my friend, Joseph Goldstein, somewhere. And Joseph and I were in the kitchen just having a cup of tea. And someone came into the kitchen in a state of some disturbance and said to Joseph, I had this really terrible experience. So Joseph said, well, what happened? And the man said, I felt all this tension in my jaw. And I realized what an incredibly uptight person I am and how I always have been and I always will be. And Joseph said to him, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And he said, yes, and I've never been able to get close to people, and it's never going to change. So Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And it was really kind of fun for me watching them go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Joseph said something like, why are you adding such a miserable self-image to such a painful experience? It's like it's painful enough to feel all that tension in your jaw, but now you're going to be alone for the rest of your life too, right? So mindfulness doesn't mean those thoughts, those reactions won't arise. They will arise, but we don't have to hold them. We don't have to take them deep into our heart. We can just let them go and say, oh, this is what's happening right now. There's tension. And it hurts, to say equanimity or to say balance doesn't mean that everything like flattens out into this gray blob. Some things are wondrous and some things are very challenging. They really hurt. But how we are with them is kind of the point. Not to wipe out the actual feeling tone all along the way, because that's impossible anyway. That's never going to happen. Even in like the Buddhist model of kind of the universe, really, where the Buddha said in every moment we experience the world in one of 6 ways. There are the 5 senses of seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. And then there's the 6th sense, which is not something paranormal, but it's knowing through the mind. Emotion, ideation, imagery. So there's 6 senses, and that model goes on to say, every moment of seeing or hearing or tasting or any of those senses, we experience as pleasant, painful, or neutral. And that sense of pleasantness, painful energy, or neutrality is not inherent in the object. It's actually a combination of many things. You might have not had any sleep, for example. So a particular comment that you overhear is very, very painful for you. Whereas another time, well rested, in love, whatever, you walk into the room, you overhear that comment, and it's kind of funny, even, and we do some amount of work investigating, like, why is it that I repeatedly experience compliments as painful or something like that? But really the work of mindfulness comes later. And that is, we experience the painful quality or the pleasantness or the neutrality of something very, very quickly. And what happens then? Can we experience the pain of something with more compassion than judgment? That's the role of equanimity in mindfulness. Can we experience the delight and the joy and the pleasantness of something and enjoy it fully without clinging, without thinking, I need, without introducing all that fear, like I've got to keep this from ever changing? And can we actually wake up and connect to neutral experience? It isn't hitting us over the head with its intensity. That is the definition of mindfulness, to be aware of what's happening in the moment without adding, grasping, aversion, which is anger or fear, or delusion, which is that spacing out. That's the equanimity right there. And without the equanimity, there's no learning. There's not the link to wisdom or clarity, because, if a certain emotion arises and immediately you're trying to push it away or disguise it or pretend it's something else, it's not the right relationship for any learning to happen, because we're just immediately in that mode of aversion. If we get lost in things right away so that they take us over, they define our world and our sense of who we will be forever, there's not the kind of right relationship for learning to happen. Like, how are we going to see the component parts of something? If you look at anger as one example, it tends to be such a complex emotion. Moments of fear, moments of sadness, maybe moments of grief, moments of helplessness, along with moments of rage. If we're holding on or pushing away or just spaced out, how are we going to see those component parts? How are we going to see the nature of constant change? Or interdependence, the causal conditions coming and going, if we're immediately reactive? We can't. And so, I think a lot of early research definitions of mindfulness didn't take the equanimity factor into account. It's more like, can you even recognize that you're feeling something? And that's a leap for a lot of us, Oh, there's this happening, there's that happening. You might hate it, but they didn't ask about that. They just asked, do you even notice that you're angry, that you're sad, that you're full of joy? And so, these days, those are considered maybe works in progress in terms of research, because there's got to be this other element. If you hear a sound and you absolutely detest it, and every cell in your body is like tightening up as though to ward it off, that's not exactly mindfulness. So equanimity, balance, is really the key ingredient in making mindfulness. And it doesn't mean coldness. It doesn't mean indifference. It's like spaciousness. It's interest, being able to take a look, like, oh, what is this? So you can't be freaking out at the same time, is the point. Probably my favorite definition of mindfulness for a while came from an article in the New York Times many, many years ago, with one of the very early pilot programs bringing mindfulness into the classroom. So this was a 4th grade classroom. So the kid in California, so the kids were, say, 9 or 10 years old. The journalist asked one of the kids, what is mindfulness? What is mindfulness? And he responded by saying, mindfulness means not hitting someone in the mouth. That's what mindfulness means. And I thought that was a great definition of mindfulness, because what does it imply? It implies knowing you're feeling angry when you're starting to feel angry. Not after you've sent the email, not after you've lashed out, but as it's just beginning. It also implies a certain balanced relationship to the anger. If you get overcome by the anger, defined by it, you're likely to hit a lot of people in the mouth, because life can be very frustrating. But on the other side, if you hate what you're feeling and you're ashamed of it, and you want to push it away and you want to deny it, you get tighter and tighter and tighter until you explode. That's not going to work either. So sometimes we call mindfulness a place in the middle. You're in no way denying what you're feeling or disconnecting from it, but you're not like sucked into it, and you're also not fighting it, pushing it away. And in that relationship, there is space. In that space, options may arise that you couldn't see before when you were in the grip of the reaction. Creativity might arise. I like to think of that kid in that space thinking, hit someone in the mouth last week. Didn't work out that well. Let me try this, something like that. So it doesn't mean you never respond, that you just become inert. We do respond, we care. We take action, we feel things about things, but it doesn't have to be driven by these old habits. We can have some space, some spaciousness. That's what balance gives us. And so, it's really not at all indifference or not caring, although it can sound like that. I came to appreciate the word balance in many ways, to continue on with an example of a kid like that. I have friends in Baltimore, Maryland, who teach yoga and meditation to young kids in the inner city, in those schools. And they told me the story. I keep putting it in my writing and I have to stop. So if anybody has a really good story that can take its place, you can send it to me. She was a little girl. She was maybe 7. So even younger than the boy in the last story. And she was often teased in school, and I think quite unfairly, but she would like beat kids up in reaction. And she was the one always in trouble and really doing badly. So they taught her these tools. And they said they came into some public space at one point, like the gymnasium or the cafeteria or something. And she was holding up another little girl by the throat against the wall. And then she said to her, "You're just lucky I learned how to meditate." She dropped her. And she went off and sat in a corner and like composed herself. But I'll just say again, it doesn't mean you never respond. It doesn't mean you don't take action, but wouldn't we like some options, and some possibilities that maybe don't signal our own downfall, that aren't so damaging to us? And so equanimity is that balance, the ability to be with what is happening without immediately holding on or pushing away. Or spacing out. So it's really a key component of mindfulness, and it's what allows mindfulness to lead to wisdom.